Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So one of the beauties of this internet world and social media is that people from around the world can reach out to you. And Nollaig Crombie, who is a very impressive young lady in Ireland, reached out to me wondering whether we were relatives. And then we got into a communication in regards to her expertise in design and creative media. So we thought it might make sense to get to know each other a little bit better by doing an interview. So this is kind of fun because Nollaig Crombie is joining us from Northwest Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And Nollaig, what's the city that you're in?
Well, it's actually a very small townsland, Brian, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
I'm very close to a small town called Rathmullen, which is on Lough Swilly, and we're right up in the northwest of Ireland in the county of Donegal.
And how far from Northern Ireland and the border are you?
So we could be in the north of Ireland within sort of a half an hour from here.
Oh, really? Okay. And and your maiden name is Crombie, and so it's the same name as mine. And you think that your forefathers came from Scotland, and what area in?
That's right. I believe Aberdeen. So we would have originated in Aberdeen.
Which is where my forefathers are from. So
Excellent.
Maybe we're related.
We could be related.
Unbelievable. But now you are the head of design and creative media at the Letterkenny Institute of Technology that's in the process of becoming a university in Donegal, Ireland.
That's correct.
And you describe yourself as a passionate traveler, a creative person, a mother, a wife, and a homemaker, not in that order.
Yeah, and I'm a sister as well.
And a sister as well. So tell me, how did you become the head of design and creative media at the Letterkenny Institute? What does one have to do from an educational standpoint or from an experience standpoint to become the head of design and creative media?
Well, I have to say from the outset, I have never been one to plan anything. So everything in my life has been accidental, but very happy accidents, I have to say. So when I was at college, Brian, I studied art and design. And specifically, I guess, for my degree show, I would have produced a book of illustrations and also a short film, along with two friends of mine. And the film was an animation, and it was very much leaning towards sort of an art form animation rather than the commercial type of animation you might see. So I had a great interest in the sort of Eastern Bloc at that time, would call it, the Polish animation, and actually the Canadian animators that really impressed me. So all of that sort of experimental animation was really high on my agenda at the time. Never thought that I'd go into the industry, but when I completed my degree, I was offered a post in Los Angeles with a company that was starting up in Ireland eventually, and the name was Sullivan Bluth. So Don Bluth was an ex-Disney animator, and he had moved away from Disney. He felt that the sensitivity towards animation wasn't really being dealt with at the time. Now we're talking back in sort of late 70s. And so he formed a company called Don Bluth, and Mara Sullivan joined in Los Angeles. And together they formed this company called Sullivan Bluth, which thrived for many years. And we made American Tail was the first movie I worked on in Los Angeles, which was also, Steven Spielberg was connected there. The next movie, George Lucas, was connected. So there was a huge activity going on in Los Angeles. So I obviously jumped at the opportunity to go to Los Angeles and had a wonderful time there. Met lots of friends actually from Sheridan College in Toronto. Right. So there were lots of Canadians there.
And when was it you lived in Los Angeles, and where did you live?
I lived in Van Nuys. So we had this wonderful apartment with pool and tennis courts and, everything that a young sort of 20-year-old would dream about. And that was in 1985. And I was there for approximately a year and a half first time round. And then I would have gone back periodically to do additional freelance work over the years.
Well, I worked for the Walt Disney Company. Interesting enough, I worked for the Walt Disney Company in Los Angeles. I did. My office was in beautiful downtown Burbank. And I lived in Sherman Oaks, so just a short distance from Van Nuys.
Oh, Sherman Oaks.
And
actually,
similarly, in a small apartment with a pool, though I didn't have a tennis court.
Well, that's really interesting because we were actually in the Sherman Oaks apartments.
Yep.
Isn't that? Yeah, wow.
I was there from 88 to 91.
Wow, I just missed you. I would have left about 87 And then when I went back, I would have been living in North Hollywood and other locations with friends of mine, I guess, just because I was freelancing and I was really just doing some part-time work.
But working on such fascinating animated films must have been an incredible experience.
It really was. I mean, I guess, you know, when you're 20 or 21, you're not appreciative of exactly what's going on at the time. And I also probably didn't ever anticipate working for one of the major companies, because I guess, again, when you're an art student, you want to be loyal to the areas of passionate artwork that you're attached to. And I had really enjoyed doing a lot of experimental artwork, and moving into that sort of mass animation, that field of, you know, high commercial activity in the cinemas and so on, didn't immediately jump out to me. But once I got into it, it really was fantastic. Yeah. And meeting so many people. I mean, you know, we had the red carpet openings and so on in Los Angeles. So it was very impressive. All of that was really, really good.
Fantastic.
Came back to Dublin. The entire company came over to Dublin. In and around that time, they were moving over slowly. Mm-hmm. And I have a cat here beside me. I'm sorry if she jumps up. So we had this wonderful location in Dublin. And we then began to recruit many, many more. In fact, I think at the peak, we had approximately 400 staff in Dublin. And they were coming from Canada and all over the world also, but a large Irish community of animators there. And I remained there up until, in about 1992, I had been traveling in between productions and really enjoyed traveling. And I had seen an advertisement in the newspaper for a lecturing post up in Donegal and have always loved rural Ireland. So with that, I sort of decided, well, I'll go and test myself around academia. Hadn't really thought too much about it, as I say. I wasn't planning anything. And fortunately, I was offered the job. I went to my then production manager in Dublin, whom I hadn't even mentioned that I was interested in going for anything different. And I explained rather sheepishly that I had gone for this interview. I didn't expect to get it. And he very kindly suggested, well, you know what you could do, Nollaig? You could take a year out, go to Donegal. If it suits you, great. If it doesn't, we'll have your job right here, but only on the condition that you would take some artwork with you when you're going. So they set up my studio in Donegal, and I continued to freelance from here for a number of years after I moved here. It all worked out really, really well because as it happened in about 1995, the company in Dublin began to reconsider their location, and they moved to Phoenix, and some moved back to Los Angeles. They left behind them a fantastic legacy, actually, because in the interim period, a number of the staff, the then Bluth staff, set up Irish companies, a wonderful company, Brown Bag, Cavalier, Cartoon Saloon, and they're all thriving at the moment. So in effect, the Sullivan Bluth days established what has now become a highly commercialized animation industry in Ireland.
What a fantastic experience that you've had. It's fascinating. We're going to take a break and come back after some messages, more with Nollaig Crombie about art and design and animation. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real honor and pleasure of mine tonight to be chatting with Nollaig Crombie, who is, we're not sure whether she's a relative of mine or not, but she does have the same last name. She's from many generations back, the same area of Scotland that my forefathers are from. And she's got a fascinating career that took her through not Disney, but through animation in the San Fernando Valley, just about the same time I was living in the San Fernando Valley, working for the Walt Disney Company. And so it's interesting. So we probably know some other people in common and probably have some other experiences. So I have to tell you a slightly funny story for me. You were sort of in the thick of things, working in the animation area. I worked for the Walt Disney Company, and I worked in a fairly senior post, working in strategic planning and corporate development, and interacting with the then CEO Michael Eisner and President Frank Wells and CFO Gary Wilson, quite a lot. But I was a finance guy in strategic planning and corporate development, and I would go out to all those parties, and we got invited to lots of parties and events, and there always seemed to be things going on. And I'd say where I worked, or I pulled out my business card that had a picture of Mickey Mouse on the business card, and people would become so fascinated and say, "Oh, can you get me a job as an actor? Or can you get me a job as an actress? Or can you get?" And I'd say, "I'm just a finance guy." And so as soon as I told them I was a finance guy, the luster of my beautiful business card with Mickey Mouse on it was sort of lost on people. But let me talk a little bit about animation and the history of animation with you, if I could, since you've got such academic experience as well as practical job experience in that area. Animation went through an incredible resurgence, didn't it? From a film standpoint, Disney did a lot of animated features back, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and then it fell into the sort of the doldrums, and then with Pixar and Disney animation and other stuff, it had a resurgence. Tell us a little bit about the history of animation in movies, if you could.
Well, to be honest, the whole commercial area of animation in Los Angeles, as I say, it would never have been on my radar other than I had been invited to work there. I had really a strong interest in the Eastern European, as it was then known, that type of animation where it was very exploratory, very experimental. It was almost, it very much was a fine art. It was artistry with a camera, with a rostrum camera. So, like for instance, my first short animated film would have been painting with a large brush on canvas with a rostrum camera looking down on it. So that type of activity really appealed to me. The whole business of animation in Los Angeles, I guess, as you know, would have been, around the Disney era. And then when Disney, I guess, weren't doing the real blockbuster type animation in around the 70s, I guess that's when Don Bluth, John Pomeroy, Gary Goldman, these are the guys that moved away and decided they want to sort of cherish what would have been, in their opinion, the fine artistry of animation. Right. And that's how they formed Don Bluth Company. And they made games for then, it would have been arcade games. The way digitization has changed things, Brian, it's really hard to comprehend that in those days we were still making, games for CD-ROMs, and it's just it just changed so dramatically. So I guess Pixar and all of those kind of activities came on board as soon as digitization became a realization for everybody. And as soon as that happened, it just blossomed into this wonderful world of what we see today now, and the Toy Stories, and from then on. And I know with my own son, it's very hard to keep him away from some of the wonderful work that's being dealt with on the kind of gaming that he does. He's 13. So yeah, in one way, my journey through animation was very much drawing on paper, and it's where I would encourage my students to continue to work on paper. I think it's where we realize our ideas. The computer, while it has wonderful power, it is still just another tool. So we have a great policy within our department of starting all of our artwork on paper, planning it, doing the layouts, finding the storyboards, and then reaching that point where you can embrace the great software that brings it all to life, but not until you can actually really find the realization of what your story is about.
I just have to read for everyone some of the animated films that you've worked on. So you were an artist on An American Tail in 1985. You were the key assistant in The Land Before Time in 1986. You were a key artist in All Dogs Go to Heaven, Rock-a-Doodle, Thumbelina, A Troll in Central Park, The Pebble and the Penguin, All Dogs Go to Heaven. And you also, with Disney Interactive, worked on The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 101 Dalmatians, and Space Jam. Quite the list of credits.
But you know what, Brian? I'll tell you an interesting story. It's just a sidebar, really. But I have a student who's just recently graduated. And he graduated a year ago, but he worked on the most recent Space Jam, which has just come out. So 25 years ago, I worked on the first Space Jam. And here I have one of my own students working on the second one.
Unbelievable. But then I got to tell you, this is interesting. Your master's thesis was on interactive media in a Down syndrome environment. Tell me about that.
Yes. Okay, so that coincided roughly with the birth of my nephew, Fionn. Fionn Crombie Angus is a wonderful musician, and he's actually producing a lot of documentaries at the moment. He's a filmmaker. He has Down syndrome. And from an early age, he obviously, like all children who have challenges, would have looked for different ways of learning. And at the time, I was really interested in the area of interactive media. And so I pursued a little investigation into how interactive media would support children like Fionn in finding their way, because a lot of our media is obviously designed for those like, fortunately, my son, who doesn't have any challenges, and he can jump in there and he can engage really quickly. And probably these days, there is a lot of material being produced for all children, all of those children who have various challenges. But just at that time, there wasn't very much happening in that area. So I was curious to do that. So that's what I undertook for my master's degree.
And what was the answer in the end? Was that what interactive media and
yeah,
arts can be very helpful to people?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, because I mean, they're visual learners, and I would consider myself a visual learner. So I sort of warmed to that area very quickly. Minimalist text, some animation, some areas of sound that relate very easily to those who are challenged with various types of sound. So the whole package became interesting.
And then you decided to embark on this academic career. And I understand that it's really your appointment as head of the department was to reach out more internationally. Tell me a little bit about that, if you could.
Yeah, I guess for all heads of departments in academia, we're encouraged to seek out partners in other countries and make connections so that we have projects ongoing. And I love that because, again, it comes back to my interest in travel. So while we haven't traveled anywhere for the last 18 months, prior to that, I would have enjoyed traveling to colleagues that I have in Finland and Stuttgart. Haven't been to Canada yet, but it's on my card.
Come.
I gotta come. I've been to China, actually. I was in China just in 2018, just got there before all of this crazy thing happened. But so we have a partnership with a university in China where the students there do their first 2 years on our curriculum in China, and then they will come to us for their third and their fourth year, and possibly their master's degree. So these type of connections have really fulfilled the type of activity that we dream about having in rural Ireland, because we can make, well, obviously with our connection as we're doing today, Brian, there's no limit to the type of connections that we can have with our counterparts in other countries. And it's a win-win situation, I always feel, in Donegal, because we've got this magnificent landscape. Today's weather isn't great, but we have had fantastic weather all summer. I'm right by the beach. We have mountains, we have a relatively small population, and yet we can do all of this interconnectivity with our partners around the world. So
when you say a relatively small population, give us a sense of the size.
Well, in our college, we have about 4,500 students. So that's a small college.
Okay. And then you keep on saying rural Ireland. So in the town or in the county, what would the size be?
Oh, in the county. I'm not good on figures, Brian. I guess I'm not even going to make an attempt to do that, actually. You're going to have to Google that one.
I'll Google that one. Okay. Now, it's interesting, at least to me, that you're so versatile in your visual arts interest. And what it says here is that you're interested in animation, and we've been talking about that, but also illustration, painting, printmaking, sculpture, bronze, and interactive design. Tell me a little bit about some of these other ones. What's the difference between animation and illustration?
Well, it's a very, very small variant. The difference is that one moves and one doesn't. So animation is basically illustration that moves. And that's where I would have come to loving animation. It was through a wonderful, actually an American animator called Harry Hess, who happened to be living in Dublin at the time when I was studying art and design. And Harry had a wonderful outlook on making any form move. So he would take ripped paper, he would take little dots, he would take, sort of like stop motion, anything at all, and he would move it under the camera. And that really appealed to me because it gave me that instinctive idea that while I truly loved illustration, and I've been drawing since I was a child and painting since I was a child, my illustrations were very detailed at times. And I wanted to see, could I actually also bring movement into them? So it was like adding another dimension to an art form that I already really, really loved. So that's really the difference. I mean, effectively, you could take a still from any animated movie and consider it an illustration, you know?
Right. And you say you also paint. Do you still paint today?
I do. I paint not as much as I like, but I am painting. I have my easel standing there all the time. It's been an extremely busy year academically, and I've had to just really focus on what has to be done in the college to make everything good and safe for the students. So, but I'm going to get back to the painting as soon as we all settle down again.
What do you like to paint? Do you paint landscapes or abstract or figures or?
No, I would say that I love to paint anything, but I guess streetscapes, and I like analytical type of detail. So something that might be maybe not necessarily very obvious to the eye, to somebody passing by, I might hone in on a detail of an area of undergrowth, or I might hone in on the subtlety of something that's happening with, I say I have cats, I've got 5 cats actually. You know, there are times, I guess, for me, art and design, well, art in particular, drawing and painting, is something that happens in the moment. It's something that happens with a moment of light, and it's a precious moment. And if you can capture it quickly, that's always been my desire, to capture something really quickly. So hence I tend to draw quickly, I paint quickly. If I'm getting into detail in something that is painterly, I probably would spend a couple of days at it, but I choose not to spend a huge amount of time on a painting. I much prefer, even looking at the fine artists of the past, the great masters, it's their sketches that really warm to me.
Oh, really?
Because it gives me that feeling that that was a moment in time. It wasn't something that was contrived or labored over for days and days and maybe treated separately as a sort of a, you know, it might have been changed from time to time, colors changed. And no, this is a moment. It has to happen in the moment.
And you also do sculpture in bronze?
Yeah, sculpture, I haven't done any for a while, but I would have done sculpture. Bronze, I really like bronze. I love, I suppose, the fact that you have to manipulate clay. I would personally choose to work with clay, and then I use what's known as the lost wax method. So it's where you pour in a latex mold, and eventually the wax all melts away and you're left with the bronze. And again, it's something that I'm beginning to think now, the last couple of years, it's been so busy, I'm going to have to wait to my retirement to get back into all of that.
What a fascinating skill base and career you've had. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Nollaig Crombie in just a minute. I'm going to ask her about sort of the trends in design and creative media, and what's happening, and what she's teaching her students, and what she thinks the future is going to hold for all of us in those areas. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm really enjoying having a chat with someone who might be a relative of mine. We're not quite sure, but she reached out from Dublin, not from Dublin, from Northwestern Ireland to me via LinkedIn, and we connected and we chatted a little bit, and we decided to have this interview because she's got just a fascinating background. She is the head of the Department of Design and Creative Media at Letterkenny Institute of Technology, soon to be university, in Donegal, Ireland. And she is a very passionate traveler. She's gone on a cargo ship from Dublin to Riga, the Trans-Siberian Railway, a boat on the Amazon, a small plane to Nome, Alaska, a bicycle in China, the Nile, the Ganges, and the Himalayas. Wow. What motivates? No, we will come back to the travel later. Like, that's fascinating that you've traveled like that. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little bit about, what your students are doing now in the school. And what you said is that they've had a big response to medical protective clothing in the design area, and that's been a big effort that some of your students are involved in, and that's really been something that, you know, is obviously called for during this last year and a half. And then also, I'd love to know a little bit about what you think is going to happen in the future with design and creative media. So tell me a little bit about the school now and what your students are doing.
Okay, so we've got 4 very strong disciplines within our school, within our faculty of design department. We would have animation, which I've spoken at length about, filmmaking, which includes documentary making, graphic and digital design, which includes a lot of commercial artwork, web design, marketing, so on. And we also have sustainable fashion and fashion with promotion. And I think that's the one that you just mentioned. Our students were very involved in the production of protective clothing during the crisis that came upon us over a year ago now. And what happened there, Brian, was really interesting. There were a lot of clothing, there was PPE that arrived from China, I believe. And of course, all of us around the world were looking for protective clothing for our medics at the time. Some of the clothing that came, they were like one piece, like, you know, like a woolly jumpsuit, if you know what I mean, with the legs and everything.
Yep.
And they didn't suit some of the medics that were working with these because they needed to get these things on and off really quickly. So somebody cleverly came up with the idea to cut the legs off. And another interesting creative in Letterkenny suggested that, well, let's not just dispose of all of this excess fabric. Let's see what we can do with all of these. So a very clever creative came up with the idea that by using 5 legs creatively, 5 of these offcuts, we could create additional one piece that would suit the medics in the hospital here in Letterkenny, and we could get pieces to them in really fast time. Every single piece of the fabric was used, right down to the cuffs, which had, the legs would have elasticated in the ankle. We took out the elastic, we used that for the ties at the back. We cut open the legs, we used 2 legs for the arms and so on and so forth. Anyway, it was a fantastic result. And we had so many people jump on board of that at that time. They gave up their holiday time, they gave up their weekends. We just called out for anybody who had a sewing machine in Donegal to give us a shout. We would have the materials to their home. They would pick up with their own protective equipment at the time, and we were very conscientious around the cleansing and the wiping and the use of the materials. All of that was happening, and we produced in excess of 500 garments during that time, just within about a week or 10 days. And that continued on then for a couple of months until we ran out of that resource, which was the excess fabric. And by that time, actually, we had managed to secure, in fact, Ireland in general had secured additional PPE, so it wasn't as big a problem any longer. But it was really fun, and it was fantastic to see the students jump into something which was a challenge. It was a real life challenge. It was something that they had to think about sustainability, and that has really embedded their ability to now design with sustainability in mind. And I sent you a couple of clips. I don't know whether you had time to see them, Brian, but we had the most wonderful fashion show about May, June. It was online, and it was all of our students coming together who had actually designed all of their garments this past 18 months in isolation. We didn't have anything on campus very often. We were occasionally booking time on campus, but it was rare. So the students really had to design and create their wonderful outfits in isolation. And then we had this magnificent fashion show online, which was just to die for. I know I'm praising my own students, but I just feel I have to. They were just fantastic.
That sounds fantastic. When you describe the fashion, you call it sustainable fashion. Why the addition of sustainability to the definition of fashion?
You know, I think there are a lot of young people who desire to work in the fashion industry, and it has been such an attractive place to work. And I myself enjoy fashion design. We all love it. And just in recent times, you know, particularly over the last decade, we've just seen so much fast fashion and the waste that's involved and the unnecessary purchasing of garments over and over and over. So we have always felt that the students at their age, they're perfectly positioned to embrace the idea that we can change how we future fashion industry. And they're doing that themselves. And I think, Brian, if we can change how that population can interpret what fashion should be, what it ought to be, how we can make it, then I think we're all winning.
Fascinating. And so what's the difference between fast fashion and I guess slow fashion?
Well, I guess you're familiar, I'm not familiar with the outlets in Canada, but we have a number of outlets here in Ireland where you can pick up a garment for €3, $3. It isn't made to last. It's made to sort of have one or two wears, and then that person would possibly dispose of it. It may go to landfill. It becomes an awful problem for our landfill issues. And so sustainability is not just about the garment itself, but I guess it's the resources that go into making the garment. It's the people who are tasked with making that garment. Very often we have historically been sourcing our garments from India, from China. Locations, as well as I do, that these are not very well paid. The individuals who work there are not very well paid. We have issues around the use of water, the use of cotton, the production of the cotton. And I know that that's shifting really, really fast. It's shifting as fast as our digitization, which is great. And I think the more we have young people being really clued into what they can do locally to change what globally is going to be a changer for everybody is worth anything. And if we can do that, I'm just saying to our students, well done. Let's do more of this.
You have another course in 3D modeling. Tell me what's happening in 3D modeling these days.
Okay, so I'm not an expert in this area. I love it, and I love the staff who work in it. We have a wonderful member of staff, Mark Cullen, who is a magnificent 3D modeler and texturer. So what he does basically is, I guess, if you think about animation and the intricate type of 3D animation that goes on in gaming and sometimes in movies and so on, there's a lot of detail in the texturing. So that's basically called 3D modeling. They work with fantastic sort of wireframe structures, which is a little bit sculptural. I mean, that's the aspect of it that I really like. And when I have delved into it slightly, you see, I'm not a tech person. This is the difference. I like the fact that these guys can do this with the wireframe, but I would probably like to prefer to have physically the wireframe in my hand. But just working from a wireframe and building up those kind of models of the character that you would like to have with different poses, different expressions and so on. And then you can very easily create the game that is required to pull on these assets very quickly.
User experience design is another course that you've got. What is user experience design?
Okay, so user experience design, we started this course about 6 years ago. And at the time, I think there was maybe just one or two other courses in the country. And we found this year, there are so many courses because every industry in Ireland seems to want to employ somebody who has an affinity towards user experience design. And basically what it is, Brian, is understanding your user. It's understanding what the client needs to produce so that the user is happy. To put it in a nutshell, if you think about how Apple have formed their everything, their entire philosophy around how the user experience is enjoyed, it's a sort of it's a clever use of design. It's one that brings the client to the center of the production and ensures that their journey with your product is going to be a really enjoyable one.
And then I guess we've talked the most about animation, but also about your other courses that are digital design, digital film, and video. And so I've got to ask you, what are some of the trends? What do you see happening in digital design, digital film, and digital video?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, digitization is all around us. There's no avoiding it now, really. I guess the filmmaking, it means that we can get things much faster. We can do things much quicker. we can produce little movies, mini movies on our phone now, which is remarkable. So to say that we're working in digital or analog, I guess the starting point is always going to be similar. Whether we work in analog and we want to start with storyboard, it's going to be the very same process that you work with the digitization of digital cameras and so on. The beauty of digitization is that you can work anywhere. You can work remotely. We have students now producing pieces here in Donegal for companies far away. And that is something that in the past, if you were waiting to have a crew gather together with all of the costs and the overheads involved, traveling to one location, it would become so costly. So digitization has made things easier and more cost effective.
What's going to happen in the future, do you think?
You know what? I think as much as digitization has become the norm for so many people, I think there is a yearning sometimes to revert back to the handcrafted. Now, maybe this has happened during COVID. I think people, you know lots of people, I'm sure, Brian, who have worked back to, gone back to whether it's baking or making or clothes making or painting or whatever it might be. It's the tactile value that the human spirit requires to engage in being a creative. I think that's where we have slightly sidestepped that with digitization, because the keyboard can never mimic the joy of holding a brush or a pencil or whatever you might be making, and maybe it's just a dream that I have, but I like to think that, in some point of our development of all of our creative world, we would probably revert to that handcraft and give value to that, pay for that, because obviously it does cost more.
So do you still teach illustration by hand? Do you still teach animation by hand?
Absolutely. Now we have, our tutors are very skilled in all aspects of teaching animation. So we have obviously 3D animation, 2D animation. We always start with pencil. We always start with paper. I met students just last week because we're all back on campus now, which is fantastic. For the first time in 18 months, we're all back on campus. And my first greeting to all of the students was, never be without a sketchbook, never be without a pencil. These are the tools that will equip you for life.
We're chatting tonight with Nollaig Crombie. She is head of the Department of Design and Creative Media at the Letterkenny Institute of Technology in Donegal, Ireland. It's a fascinating conversation about design, about illustration, about animation, about our family history, about our work histories. It's interesting. We're going to take a final break for some messages and come back more. And I'm going to ask her a little bit about passion and about travel and about the benefit of the arts. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine to meet someone who might be from across the world, a relative of mine. We're not sure. Nollaig Crombie. She's the head of design and creative media at the Letterkenny Institute of Technology in Donegal, Ireland. She's a passionate traveler. She's an illustrator. She's an animator, and she's head of the department and an academic. Nollaig, I've got to ask you a couple of final questions, if I could. You've done this fascinating travel using different and interesting ways of travel. You've been on a cargo ship. You've been on the Trans-Siberian Railway. You've been on a boat on the Amazon, a small plane in Alaska, a bicycle in China, the Nile, the Ganges, the Himalayas. Why?
Why? Yeah, you know what? I think I was very lucky to have the parents that I had. And my parents were both scientists. My father would have traveled a lot extensively to conferences. And every time he came back when I was a child, I used to yearn to go to the places that he used to talk about. So in fact, the arts and the sciences are very closely aligned, I always feel.
Yep.
And many of my family, I'm one of 9, and everybody in our family is either a scientist, an engineer, or an artist. And all of these kind of investigative type of activities are very similar. So when I was a child, I used to open up, I mean, if a cat came in with a dead bird, for instance, I shouldn't praise the cat, but I would dissect the bird and I would draw the bird and I would look at the insides and I would really engage myself. And for a long time, I always felt I was going to be maybe a scientific illustrator. I had no idea what I might become, but science and art were always very balanced for me. And then on top of that, the travel to locations where my father had a fantastic affinity with communities which were perhaps more like the Inuit communities in locations that were hard to access. And I guess they were very remote. And part of his scientific interest was developing crops that would support people in areas where perhaps there was drought or there were various land difficulties. So he would have been to Russia in the 70s. He would have been right across America in various locations. He was, right throughout every part of the world. What
was your father's occupation?
So he was the head of the Agricultural Institute in Carlow, which is it's an organization which looks at the best ways to engage in agriculture.
Fascinating.
Okay? Yeah, but he also produced a number of crops. So he produced a beet, for instance, a beet crop, which was then used after the war when it was very difficult to import seed. That was the crop that was used in Ireland, and it became a thriving industry, actually, the sugar beet industry. But anyway, so all of that sort of travel that my father did really embedded this need for me to go traveling. So when I got my first passport, I was away. I was just gone. And I also had that wonderful desire to be within communities who would have been more difficult to access, let's say. And again, like today, you could say that to a young person today and they'd probably say, well, why bother? Would you not just kind of Google the area, But in those days, you have to remember that you had to travel to these areas with all sorts of restrictions. It was very hard to get into places in Russia. It was very hard sometimes to get into certain locations in South America or lots of different areas. But my desire to kind of take alternative routes of travel, I guess, or transport would be because I just like the adventure. I like meeting people accidentally. And so if you go on a cargo ship, the chances are you're going to meet people that you didn't expect to meet.
No question.
And you're going to be in the company of people that you didn't anticipate and all of that goes with it. And train journeys, I just adore.
Well, I got to tell you, one of the things that you got to do is you got to take the train that goes across Canada through the Rockies and paint some mountains like
yes, that's exactly.
Our famous artists have passed, the group of 7 that painted. Nollaig, I've got to ask you, we may have some students, you've got students all the time that listen to you. What advice to students do you have today?
I would say to any student, think about being your best self. There's no point in comparing yourself to the person next beside you in the room because, particularly in art school, when you come to the arts, you might have been the best in your class in secondary school, and suddenly you find yourself in with 20, 25 people who are all equally very talented. And there's no point in beginning to compare yourself with others. So you have to become your better self, just the best that you can be. And also, I would say risk-taking is really important. I mean, all my life, I have taken risks. It's exciting, it's daring. Sometimes you come across problems, but I think in the long term, if you're willing to take risks, you will have the best of everything.
Nollaig Crombie, head of design and creative media at the Letterkenny Institute of Technology, soon to be a university in Donegal, Ireland, which, by the way, I understand the National Geographic says it's the #1 cool place in the world or something like this.
Yes, we were nominated. In fact, we won the coolest location by National Geographic in 2017.
And cool not being temperature, cool being fun.
Oh, yeah. No, just very cool in every respect. But actually, no, we've had really good weather. So I would say to all of you Canadians, come on over. We can offer you wonderful beaches, great hospitality. And now that the pubs are back open, we can offer you a pint of Guinness.
Pint of Guinness sounds like it's a compelling opportunity. Nollaig, It's a pleasure to meet you. And thank you so much for reaching out and telling us a little bit about digital media, about animation, about technology, about travel, and about being the best you can be and taking risks. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.